one of our parents, their model was wherever I go in there, I rip everything out, I put my standard in, I spend the money, I make sure it works, and I go on because they didn't like surprises, and I can see that because we some of them we did a little more saving and we had surprises, but I think when you do that, you throw out the infrastructure, you put your standard network in, you throw in your firewalls, you throw in this, the standard solution, the business, and you map it all over. I think it costs a little more, but it's going to save you a lot of time.
Growing a business requires a holistic approach that extends beyond sales and marketing. This approach needs alignment among people, processes, and technologies. So if you're a business owner, operations, or finance leader looking to learn growth strategies from your peers and competitors, you're tuned into the right podcast. Welcome to the WBS Podcast, where scalable growth using business systems is our number one priority. Now, here is your host, Sam Gupta.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's show. And if you're joining for the first time, this is part of our podcast series in which we invite very exciting guests. And for today, we have a rock star here from the IT community, and we are going to get to his intro just in a second. But we do these interviews every Friday between 8 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern, depending upon the time zone. Sometimes people are available at 8 a.m. Sometimes they could be in Pacific, so we have to accommodate those. So stay tuned for more episodes in the future. We are going to have a lot of CIOs, in line. We are going to be bringing some more guests from the retail community, from the manufacturing community, every single industry out there. So stay tuned for that. If you have not checked some of our previous episodes, we have some of those as well. So make sure you guys check that as well. So on that note, Fred, I'm going to hand over to you. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself as well as your current focus?
Sure. My name is Fred Donatucci. I've been in technology for over 25 years, last 15 in leadership roles with some Fortune 1000 companies first, with like Honeywell and Mattel and Avery Dennison, and most recently with more of a mid-sized company. I took the leads and ran the IT organization for the last 3.5 years. My focus right now is two things: one, advisory to other CIOs and helping with their transformations in their organizations, and the second part, helping out, looking to permanently help another organization for their perfect opportunities. So it's an exciting time for me, and I'm really excited to be here. And thank you for inviting me.
Of course, and welcome again. If you're in the audience joining for the first time, I'm personally a big fan of three-way conversation, even though you might be listening right now. But we feel that you are part of the conversation. So if you have any sort of stories, comments, questions, whatever you have, please share those, and we like to include that as part of the conversation. So please feel welcome as part of the conversation and share your thoughts and insights. So on that note, Fred, we have one of these standard questions that we ask every single guest. That is sort of the podcast theme. So, what is your perspective on business growth? How do you see it?
Currently, business growth is interesting. I think we're just coming out of a really interesting time where the interest rates went kind of crazy and leverage was very expensive. So a lot of these companies who were over leveraged, they had some of these debt load, and debt load really impacted how much they can spend from the capital market. So for me, I think we're coming into a really good, interesting time with the business growing. I see us as a technologist sometimes coming in and helping out with some tools to really enable that. I know you guys talked about AI and other things, which are really interesting. And I think for my role as a business leader, coming with that kind of tool belt is trying to help them out. I see the industry really consolidating. If I talk about specifically, go about paper in a couple of minutes, that industry was really consolidating. You're seeing a lot of that happening in the private equity area. You're seeing a lot of consolidations. So I think it's growing. I just think it's coming and starting to look like a little bit of a different flavor as capital markets start growing a little bit and people are investing in businesses.
Okay, amazing. So obviously we want to talk about the paper industry today, and which is a very interesting industry. And I'm going to provide some insights from my perspective in terms of what I have personally seen in the industry. Obviously, as you correctly pointed out, I mean, traditionally it was always a very fragmented industry.
Correct.
A lot of mom and pop, many different business models. I tend to, and I don't know how you sort of see it. I know that, when we were talking, you were talking about print and paper. I guess that's probably the traditional bucketing, how this industry would position themselves. But in that as well, I guess there are many different business models. So number one is going to be, in my mind, I don't know if contract manufacturing is probably going to be the right bucket. They do manufacture a little bit, but it could come across as more of the marketing agency as well at times, depending
Exactly.
upon how you view it, right? But
Right.
then there are going to be three different buckets because, in general, the packaging is very interesting. When you go to, let's say, manufacturers, one thing that they don't want to deal with is packaging. Okay,
Correct.
it's always outsourced. Okay,
Yeah.
that's going to be the last step in the production process. They are going to hire, and sometimes I see it as more of the service as a service offering, I guess.
Yep.
Because you are sort of renting the machine. So this is one, right? And overall, from the business model perspective, one business model is going to be something that you talk about. You have these roles, cut them into pieces, sell it to somebody, I guess. The second is going to be the real packaging, where you are sort of getting the packaging. Let's say if you are going to be a food manufacturer, and then the third could be a real print sort of space, which is very different in general. So maybe provide overarching definition of how the industry is structured. How many different business model have you seen separately versus together? And then obviously you are going to talk about the consolidation as well. So I guess these consolidations are probably happening, with the business model the way I probably described, right?
Yeah. No. And I like the way you put it together. When I first went in here and I into this industry, I've come from a lot of different industries in manufacturing, CPG, aluminum manufacturer, even in pipes and all this kind of fun stuff. But when I came here, it was interesting because you look at the industry across there, and it's really a tale of two kind of almost tell of two cities, right?
Yeah.
You have this one like Georgia Pacifics and the West Rocks, and these real big companies, and they have a lot of investment in there, and they do a lot of paper mills and all that fun stuff. And then like you said, you have these mom and pops are the opposite, and they're really investing in the operational technology to give them make them do more and run it quicker. And then if you look at the paper industry, corrugated, for example, it starts with the mills. And we were talking, I'll go real quickly just to give you an idea as I go through the different areas. The corrugated produces paper. It takes fiber, adds water, goes from 90% to another number and gives you, these big rolls of paper. They make sheets out of it, and then they make boxes or displays out of it. So
Yeah.
there's like this three steps in this process. And the first step, that mill process, is very automated. If you look at where a lot of the technology investment is, it's in that because it's a continuously running in any mill application,
Yeah.
mill, and it's generating cash, right? So 24/7, I'm going to run, I'm going to generate cash, I'm going to produce these things. And so the big companies as well as some of the independents have invested technology to make sure that runs very well. But when you start going down to the next couple of levels, that's where you see a lot of these mom and pops and these different type of technologies, and they're making that the idea between, am I going to invest in the operational technology to make sure this thing runs, and then my IT, whatever's left in the budget, I'm going to do, right? So it's an interesting model that you see this, and a lot of them have these older technologies that just run for them, and they just make it work. So if you look across there's a different kind of an investment model on how they do it.
Yeah, so very interesting. So I guess one of the points that I'm going to pick from your commentary is 24 cross 7, and which is always very tricky, very interesting, very challenging. But in my mind, and I'm going to provide some commentary in terms of what I have seen in the other industry. And if you're not familiar with them, obviously we can discuss that as well, right?
Sure.
So when I look at 24 cross 7, in my mind, I'm looking at automotive, I guess.
Okay.
The way automotive would work, right?
Yep.
Very different operation from the ERP perspective. The way they run, the way they schedule, the way they are going to have their shop floor. It's very different.
Yep.
So, do you see any similarities with that? Do you see any sort of differences when you look at paper industry? Do you have any comments there, Vincent?
Yeah, I mean, probably there's some similarities, but I think when you look at the paper industry, it's a lot more simpler, right? Because you're basically having these long rolls that are continuously running, and your
Yeah.
optimization is how do I cut them and make them simple. So you
Yeah.
don't have those big kind of bill of materials or the other things that you'll have in the automotive industry, but you do have that continuous motion, like you said. You're trying to continually do it. I think the same thing that the automotive industry would see around downtime and losing money, the mill sees the same thing. You stop that, and all of a sudden you're bleeding money because you're never going to make up that the capacity again. Um, so there are some similarities there, I believe. But I really think downtime and optimization and speed is the biggest thing you're going to see in a paper mill. How do I get it running? How do I get the right mix? How do I do it quickly? And any kind of changeovers are as fast as possible.
Yeah, so very interesting. So in this particular case, so let's say if we just talk about the mill operations, right?
Sure.
And one of the comments then when we were discussing in the pre-show was that any of the vanilla ERPs are probably not going to be a good fit, or they would require a lot of customizations. And sometimes it's very hard to predict how they are going to go, right? Because
Yeah.
you are dealing with a lot of constraints, and even for experts, it's very, very, very hard to forecast those constraints, because any vanilla software is designed from a very specific operating model, is probably the right term I could use.
I
I don't
agree.
know, right?
Yes.
You have data model constraints. I mean, it's not supposed to have the infinite capacity, or just the, what is that called, the infinite elasticity, I guess. Can I use
Yes.
that term, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Moving around.
yeah, exactly. So maybe talk about the differences and the nuances. So let's say, I'm coming to you, Fred. I'm bringing, I don't know, I'm probably going to use some names here, okay? Some of the generalized ERPs, SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, you name it, right?
Right.
Those are probably generalized, right?
Sure.
If somebody comes to you, obviously, based on my discussion with you, that you are probably not going to be comfortable with that idea, I guess. So
Yeah.
why would you talk about the nuances? I mean, where the challenges are, I guess, what does not work? Maybe describe the data model, why it is different. Are the bombs going to be different? Are the unit of measures going to be different? The contractual relationships are different. So what is so different?
Yeah. No. No. And that's a great question. And what I would say is it gets worse as you go down the chains, right? So the paper mills, I think of all three steps, probably could force a model
Yeah.
somewhat, because it's continuous operations, and you look at SAP or other one else, they have mill solutions, and a lot of that would work. But when you start moving it down, and you're trying to integrate these processes across the chain, it gets more and more complicated, because it does very specific things around paper grades and weights and cutting, and how do I make it at the right stiffness, and
Yeah.
can this fall into the other ones, like so I think the challenges you have is really, if you're running one by itself, it probably can work better. When you're trying to put things together is when you start having a little bit of the issues. And I really see that when you talk about a sheet feeder, which turns those rolls into sheets, and when you go into the box plants, which makes the displays in the boxes, those are very, very specific. And I think when you try to customize it, you're spending a lot of time reinventing a wheel that seems like it's already been created with these niche solutions.
Yeah, so very interesting. So
Yeah.
let's go back to my comment related to it being more of the marketing agency, right?
Sure.
I don't know if mills are going to be in the sort of the marketing agency business, right? These are
Yeah.
going to be the companies that are sort of producing the real box,
Yeah. Yeah.
and right. So
Exactly.
they are going to comply with a lot of quality requirements that their customers are going to impose. I
Right.
guess, for example.
Moisture and moisture, stiffness, all this kind of testing they do to make sure it falls that the right quality when you put that box together, or where they put the corrugating together.
So is that going to be a part of the mill operation as well, or would that
It
fall
is.
under? That's part of mill. Okay.
Yeah,
So
because there's a lot of testing. So I think the interesting thing about the mill operation is a lot of the work when you're doing the mill operation works on the OT side. So
yeah,
you'll have these, and you have to integrate it back in, because once
yeah,
you produce it as a grade and everything, but you're going to have like these, ABBs and other companies that are going to help you on that side and run it, unless you have a real large organization. And they're the ones who are going to have these operational technologies that are going to help you get the grades.
yeah,
But you need to bring it back into the ERP system. You need to do the testing. You need to show those in there because that's what they're going to want to look at, especially when they're trying to match those roles up to customers.
Yeah, so very interesting, and this is a very interesting debate because anytime when I talk to my OT folks, and I think the point that you are trying to describe, and I don't know whether you are familiar with sheet metal industry. In sheet metal industry, also they have very similar challenges. My understanding would be the difference between sheet metal and this would be that sheet metal is going to be slightly more expensive than paper. I don't know. You can probably tell me more.
I'll say it depends, but go ahead.
Yeah. So maybe you can talk about where paper is going to be more expensive. I guess there is always a possibility, right? But sheet metal, one of the challenges that they have, and they define this as more of the nesting process. Nesting. I don't know whether you have heard the term. I don't know if they use in the mill operations or not, but this would fall under very similar process. Now, some ERP systems, some ERP vendors, they have nesting as part of their functionality, but some are going to feel that that's out of my scope. Okay, that goes into OT technology. Get probably an MES, which is going to be manufacturing execution system. Keep it there because I'm not going to be integrating with my machines, because when you are going to integrate with machines, now we are trying to bring some of the operational data, and I'm not too sure if I'm comfortable with that idea, to be completely honest.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Right. So Mick, talk about whatever thoughts you have. I guess
Yeah, no, and that's an interesting issue because you have all that data coming off on the operational side, and all these PLCs being generated, right?
Yeah.
And you have to put them somewhere, and it's a ton of data, right?
Yeah.
And it's at the edge, so there's certain things you want to see and you want to operate from there, but there's certain things you want to aggregate to make sure you're seeing the right things. And this also goes into things like predictive analytics, right? So as you start seeing your machine and the downtimes and a motor breaking or a felt breaking, you want to be able to feed that data into that model, but you also want to pull that data out eventually so you can see how things are running, get your golden run and all that kind of fun stuff that you want to do to make sure you have the perfect mix on those areas. I think the best way that I've seen it done, or the way that I like it, is using the edge technology to really consolidate that data so it's there, it's quick, and it's not going and there's no latency. And then basically aggregating that and pulling that in with the data that you need. Because I think that helps. You don't need all that data going into your ERP system, but you need some of it. And I think that feed of what goes in there as you're producing the data makes the most sense. But it makes it a little more complicated when you're talking about, then you start going to cybersecurity issues and how do you make sure who's talking to what. But I think that makes the most sense. And it also allows the autonomy if a network goes down or something bad happens, that the plant can still run without its ERP system. It can just start generating paper because it has all the technology it needs at the plant just to do the operations.
Yeah, so very interesting. So maybe talk about the golden run a little bit. I mean, you use that term, and I don't know if people are going to be familiar with that. So maybe describe that and maybe layer in the context from the paper industry perspective as well, if there are going to be any sort of nuances for the paper industry related to golden run.
Yeah, and I'm going to do the best I can because I was like 3.5, 4 years into it, and I understand a lot of the concepts. But the golden run basically is taking the speed, the moisture, the weight, the amount of fiber you put in there, and you get those settings on the machine to just the right way that it produces the best quality, the fastest way, and you can capture those settings and reproduce it. So you then use that as the milestone of what you're trying to produce. So if you're producing a certain weight, these things put together will give you the most optimum results in that weight. So you can sell it at that weight. So 26-pound weight, it will meet all the tests, and you can sell it, and it has the right consistency. So they kind of do that to find that speed setting, moisture content, all that kind of stuff that it runs through, so you can produce the best quality at the fastest speed.
Yeah, that would be my understanding as well. So thank you so much for sharing that. So now let's go back to the comment about continuous operations, right?
Sure.
So continuous operations in general is very interesting as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
And we see this term being used in many different industries. Okay, so one aspect which is super challenging, and I don't know how they deal with it, to be completely honest. I have seen all sort of scenarios. Sometimes that could be described as more of the train wreck, because they don't really have any answers, and they could do whatever they could do in their power to be able to accommodate that, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, you are going to see continuous operations in industries such as your when you are doing the petroleum, I guess, and then you have these liquids flowing in, that is going to be one continuous operations, right?
Yes.
You have very similar continuous operations in the mining industry as well. And the whole idea, at least in my understanding, and you can probably, provide some commentary from your experience as well. The whole idea of continuous operations is going to be just like you have project management, you have start, finish, you can sort of estimate the cost, what you are clocking in for the project. With continuous operations, you don't necessarily have a start or finish. So
No.
how do you sort of accommodate the cost? So that is one perspective. The second
Sure.
perspective, I think, that you are trying to describe is more from the just continuous run perspective, meaning your operations are running continuously. So when you say continuous operations for the paper industry,
Right.
what are different factors, I guess, that are going to be relevant for that? Is it going to be the whole continuous run where you don't have a start or finish, or is it going to be 24 cross 7?
So it is 24. It is 24/7, and I think it breaks down to how you plan the runs. So the runs are usually in a 24-hour period of time, but they're also produced by weights. So if you're going to run and you're going to layer all these 26-pound weights together, you'll probably run them to give the best continuous operations. So you look at those optimizations. I mean, when you look at it, you basically look at each run and each customer and how you produced against it. You'll look at the tonnage is the basic thing. How much tons, how many tons did I produce for the day? And then how did I go against the metric that I signed up for? And also look for how we're fulfilling our customers. Now, you can either have direct sales or sometimes they go through brokers, and then you would see how many of these I'm producing. So I think when you look at it, you're trying to say, how much am I producing to meet the needs? Am I producing and optimized? Am I producing extra tons sometimes just to run it out because I'm optimized at 26. I'm going to produce this 26. Do I run this thing out? And now I'm going to switch over and produce a lighter or heavier weight, depending on what the customer needs. So I think looking at it, a 24-hour period is usually what a lot of times they do. They look at it on the runs they do for certain customers and certain weights, and they break it down based on that. When you're trying to optimize, you'll see, hey, this machine is doing really, really well at this lighter weight, but it's having trouble on the heavier weight. How can we optimize that? And then when you have multiple mills, then you can start moving things around to see if there's an optimization there.
Yeah, so very interesting. And, some of the things that I'm thinking, at least the way you are describing from the weight perspective, I guess, right? Weight is a very interesting measure, and not many industries use that.
Right.
Okay. And I always like to cross-pollinate, between different industries, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So weight is going to be relevant in the food and beverage industry, which is sort of, you have some overlap with the packaging industry as well, because I think a lot of these boxes are probably going there.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And it's all shipping. So you have to think about the weight has a very good impact because you're adding to your shipping costs, right? So there's a very big focus on strength versus weight, that trade-off.
So talk about that a little bit more. So when you talk about this impact, is this impact driven by the customers that they want to make sure that the box weight is not going to be too much? But I'll share one more story, I guess, related to this. So I was doing one of the episodes with a packaging consultant, and you know how they are, right? Typically they are brought in because you are going to have these packages rolling on the conveyor, and the box was breaking. It would not sort of stand on its own, right? So they had a lot of issues with it, from the product perspective. Now there were a lot of possibilities there. Number one, how you are packaging, how the real packaging is. Are you stuffing way too much? In that could be a possibility as well, right?
Sure.
So weight could be a different factor, and I think the point that you made is that the weight is going to matter more from the courier perspective as well, because your cost is going to increase, but the strength has to be there of whichever material that you are using. So you need to sort of balance these things. So are these things driven by the customers, or are these things driven by the mill operators that they need to think about, all of those factors when they are designing this?
I think they're driven by the mill operators' customers. So, and it can either be their downstream companies that they work with. So it can be the sheet feeders, or it can be the packaging companies that's saying, hey, I need to fulfill a certain weight for my customer to make sure it works. And now when you're making corrugated, there's three pieces. There's the medium and there's the outsides, right? So you put those three together, and there could be a combination of different weights to give you that same outcome. So that's the other thing. And it depends again, because you're looking for a certain strength sometimes on the paper. Now you may have paper that's heavier that didn't fulfill the quality for that heavy weight, but it fulfills for a different weight, and they send it to it, but it may weigh heavier too. So that may be an issue. So you have all these different qualities you have to work with your customer to say, hey, you're looking for X, Y, and Z. I can give you that, or hey, this one fulfills this, or you may sometimes give them something that's a little bit different, but maybe a savings for them that can fulfill it. But it really comes down to how they're going to use and put it all together. The sheet feeders will put it together, and they'll make those in the right weight combination, and then that strength will be made into boxes.
Yeah, so very interesting. I guess, one aspect is always going to be OT in this particular space, that it's probably going to be trickier because you need to feed right data to your machines to be able to cut the right dimensions. But then I think there is going to be the estimation processes as well, which are going to be extremely tricky. And in general, based on my experience in this industry, to be completely honest, they generally use very tailored software. Because none of the ERP systems are probably going to work for their needs, right? So maybe talk about the estimation processes a little bit in terms of what you have seen, what kind of challenges you have seen with that, and do you ever see any ERP estimation processes to be used in this industry?
So I'm not going to say it's not possible because I haven't seen every single solution that's out there, but I can tell you in the middle market, which I have a lot of experience for, you're going to see people. You're going to see this weird. You're going to see the combination almost the best in breed. You're going to have a financial system mostly that drives a lot of your financial stuff, your indirect procurement, other stuff, and then you'll have your packaging MES kind of ERP solution there that drives it, and it drives it because you really do have to do this estimation. You have to know the different grades you're running in there. You have to know the different cut sizes and trims, and it goes back to a CAD system a lot of times. They'll produce it out there and they'll load it into the system, and they'll see trim patterns and how to put it together. And I think you look at some of these solutions and robustly, they're not great, but they're really good at those different things that are differentiators. And I can think of like Kiwi and Amtech are probably two solutions that come to my mind, and they're very, very good at those sections. Now people augment them with the other solutions like an SAP or an Oracle because they don't have that robustness. Our financial systems may be poor. We try to do some integrations with them, and some of the things I saw were just surprising. It just, but it gives you that core that you really want to do right, because you want to estimate your standard cost. You want to figure out how much these steps cost. You want to look at the right different grades of paper and how do you put it together with their special sauce, and then get it out to the customer so you can make sure you're doing, economically profitable paper, right?
Yeah, so very interesting. So I don't know, I think it's been a while since you did this, right? So I don't know how much you are going to remember, but do you remember anything from the integration perspective? What kind of challenges were you facing? Were these primarily related to the way data model is structured, or what was that, I guess?
So it's interesting. A lot of these, they come out with these core systems, and then they say, hey, we almost want to try to be an ERP to the small market, right? So they buy and they throw these things on.
Yeah.
And I'll be friendly because I don't want to really throw anyone under the bus. But one solution we were looking at, and we were trying to put the financials in there, the data model was strange because it would generate it on demand, and then you have to pull it over. So there was no tables to pull. Like if you go to an SAP or Oracle, and you're trying to find transactions and pull those transactions over, so you do a financial consolidation.
Yeah,
those tables don't exist unless when they run it, they create these temporary tables. You pull the data in, and you can do it. So. And the data models were created from different vendors and put together, so the models don't even make sense. So you look at it, it's done this way over here, and you go over here, and it's different. And so you have the complexity of doing that and putting it together and pulling that data to get a centralized view makes it much more complicated. So it goes from these very niche solutions to then you get to the Dynamics, which are probably a little better at it, and then you get to the bigger ones like the Dynamics 365 and Oracle and all those, and they do it a lot better because. It's funny. When we were trying to fix some of the solutions, I kept on going back to the models that I knew from the big ERPs. I was like, why can't it just do this? But we had to fix it. So you get it. Just challenges. If you want to do it the exact way they're doing it, and keep all the data there, it does a very good job at that. But once you want to take your business processes, then you may have different divisions, different ways of seeing things, and you want to put that in there. Maybe AP, maybe AR, centralized, vendor, customer credits, all that kind of stuff. Then it gets kind of complicated.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. I mean, when we look at these niche, solutions as well, and sometimes, I mean, we feel lost as well, to be completely honest, because we are going to feel, hey, I mean, I have my, bombs down, I have my skills down, I probably have some costing fundamentals down, but
Yes.
now I'm looking at this data model, and it's going to be completely strange, and people are going to ask questions. Okay, how do you do this? I don't know.
Yes.
I have no clue because it's not making any sense. I've never seen this before. I don't know how they are going to do it. So maybe touch a little bit more in terms of this whole temporary aspect, which could be very creative. Obviously, there must be a reason why they did it, right?
Yeah.
So describe a little bit more in terms of what was your expectation in terms of seeing those tables. Were they computing these bombs on the fly? Were they computing the whole resource model on the fly? Was it costing that was on the fly? What was on the fly aspect that you would not expect, I guess?
Yeah. So some of the data was there, and I think that's a strange part, because in going back to the model that these were created by different vendors and put together, right? So if you look into the manufacturing area,
yeah,
a lot of that stuff existed because you had the different weight tables, and you can see that, and to put it together, and you have a pretty good idea of what each ran.
Yeah.
But the problem, what happened is the afterthoughts, right? So again, we'll go back to financials. We were working with a CFO, and he went. The systems had multiple systems that were generating a trial balance, right? You had all these different systems, and you really couldn't get an overall view of what's happening. So how do we pull them together? Like, financial consolidation, classic Hyperion, Oracle. But now you have the one streams and everything. So how do you put that all together? So we started going through that, and some systems like GP was beautiful. It was right there. You know what it is. Boom, it's in your system. Now when you got to these niche systems, like I said, it didn't exist. Like, you're looking for this data, and then you said, oh yeah, it's in this table. And you look for the table and it's empty. I was like, how's the table empty? Like, you had to be doing transactions before. And so that was the weird thing. So they ran it and they looked, and when you were running it, it was generating this table.
Yeah.
And it was, for us, it was just really strange. Like, and then we had to try to match up where the data lived and put it together, because it was different pieces. So it was a harder complex to get the data out. Now, after you do a lot of that work, you can normalize it, pull it somewhere else, and then you see it as your enterprise data. And for this, where I was at, that made sense, because that it was doing a decent enough job. It's very labor intensive there, and we want to make sure that we can do the right estimating of cost. We decided to use this across different packaging companies. So that was the way for us to put it together. But that process, like, I have to say, when you're going down to those lower tiers, those unique systems, be prepared for surprises, because you're going to find them. If you get away from their core area and you're trying to do something that makes sense to you, but it may not make sense to them, because they have a very narrow path the way they do their business processes. And if you go left or right, it may be some uncharted territory that you're going to really have to work on.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting segue. So maybe, I don't know, Amici, maybe we should probably talk about some of these stories, that you had, right? I mean, so obviously you have looked at many different systems when you were a part of in this job and many other jobs, right?
Yes.
So when you are doing the selection process, and when you are going to be in industries like this, obviously it's tricky. It's not easy, okay? Because you are going to have generalized system, and you don't know how to go from point A to point B. Obviously you are going to have a lot of surprises there as well. Okay, these standardized things are going to be okay, but how about industry specific things? And when you look at the industry specific systems, you are going to have a lot more surprises.
Exactly.
Right. Now you don't know how to do accounting, I guess. So describe the process, how it started, I don't know, whichever story you want to pick, what was the mindset of the organization, because they need to be prepared as well, right? When you talk to any organization, every executive is going to have millions of ideas. And when you talk about executing them, oh my goodness, it's hard, right? So So describe the story, whichever story you have, how it went, how it started, what were the options?
Yeah, and I understand what you're asking for, and let me jump. I'll jump to a story that's kind of similar to it.
Yeah,
we were doing a lot of acquisitions, right? And you would acquire from a mom and pop, and you acquire from a bigger company that could have a bigger system, a more standardized system. So I'll give you two examples. One was from one of the big paper companies.
Yeah.
They had Bond. So, Infor then took that over, but it was Bond and it was running and they had it customized. So that was interesting because there was 5 guys from the UK who were supporting the system. We had to get those guys and they were moved on to other stuff. And we're trying to say, hey, how do we get this data out of here? Because we move it to our other system. So that was, so you get those systems that are out there in these companies because they just run the manufacturing and they do well and they just leave it there. And then when you try to move it to something a little more standardized, you run into that. But we also ran into another one, and it was more of a mom and pop, didn't have a big IT budget, but they had a really smart guy who liked to code. So take a 20-year-old system. Let's call the guy Bob. Bob comes in, and Bob customizes it for 20 years. Now, Bob also created new functionality that doesn't really exist, that's unique for them. Bob takes out the thought processes that people would have before, and now the black box does it for them. And so when you're trying now to transfer it over, when you do the initial mapping of requirements, okay, some things seem like they match. But when you try to put a person in front of a system, they're like, well, where's Bob's report 6, 7, and 8? Because I don't know how to release those things. That's Bob's report does that for me. So you have these weird complications that they're very, very unique, but you have to get rid of these systems because they're running on software that you have isolated, because if anyone would touch it, they can, they can exploit it 10 times the Sunday, right? They're going to, there's so many exploits in those older software. So for us, that was a challenge. So we thought we had it there. We went to user testing and the users couldn't do half the stuff because things were missing. Yeah. So then we had to figure out, well, where can we train them, or where the skill set wasn't there, that we needed a new version of Bob's report, just because these were critical things that we needed to get going fast. And if we had to train it was a whole new skill train over. So they're the kind of complications that are the surprising things when you go into these systems, that then you have to try to match the data out. And the interesting thing about, you talk about these niche solutions, they buy up these old systems because they want those customers to come over. So now you're dealing with one, they own these guys, and you say, okay, help us with this. Well, there's only 2 people left who do it. One guy's in sales now, and they're all trying to guess it too. So it turns into these very interesting creativity, problem-solving situations that you have these gaps that unless you ask the right questions and you try to model it out, can surprise you later on. So I think that was one of my biggest surprises I went in this industry, is how different some of these things can be, and even a term or a process of releasing things to the manufacturing floor to be so different.
Yeah, could not agree more. I mean, I have seen very similar stories as well, and I think the consolidation is going to be painful from both perspectives. Whether we talk about just the software consolidation, just companies acquiring companies, and because of that, I mean, you are going to have very organizational division. I guess that's what you were talking about, from the vendor perspective. But the same thing could happen that I have personally seen, from the real consolidation, when, let's say, in your paper industry, you are sort of trying to get one company, and your assumption is going to be that, hey, I've done my due diligence. Okay, everything is going to be okay. I'm going to get this market share. And then all of a sudden you get into these integration issues, right? And now you cannot integrate. So in your experience, let's say if you were the advisor for any companies and doing these acquisitions or thinking of acquisitions or doing some sort of vertical integration, would you do this in the diligence phase, or would you delay it? Because if you delay it, then obviously there are going to be a lot of surprises, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think when you're going through the due diligence, right, you're trying that technical design document, you're trying to figure out how it looks like when you're evaluating an acquisition. You got to ask a lot of questions, and you got to start looking for, if it smells a certain way, if it tastes a certain way, it is probably a certain way.
Yeah.
And you'll see things like they don't have Wi-Fi. Okay, that's strange. They don't know their own password. Someone signs it on for them. There's weird things that will come out that you'll start seeing, or there's a weird integration. There's a weird dependency on X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of like pulling the string. And I think that's where you have to do it. And then if you start smelling that, you'll say, hey, by the way, it's going to be okay. I think this makes sense because it has this machine, this machine, this machine, and you can bring things over there. But it sounds like there's going to be surprises, and when you move it over, be prepared that it may take us a little time to get to our standard solution, because we may have training issues. We may have process issues. We may have a whole bunch of other things there. We may have to run Wi-Fi through a 200,000 square building, whatever it is, right? Yeah, these are the things that you have to deal with, and you have to say, are those giving me clues that how complicated this could be? And it's usually the mom and pops who spend a lot in the operational technology, did IT as a side thing, and there's a lot of technical debt that you're going to pay that you can't even see yet.
Yeah, could not agree more. And this is why any of the consolidations, I guess, or the integration, they are always going to be tricky. And I always like to relate this as more of, let's say if you're buying home, obviously I'm trying to simplify here, but even that could be very challenging, right?
Right.
So in this particular case, I guess, I mean, one thing that most people, even private equity companies, what they're going to assume is, hey, any of the IT infrastructure that you're going to have, I don't know how much useful that is going to be. Even if you have implemented a modern ERP system 1 year back, I'm probably going to scrap it out because I'm probably going to roll you into slightly more modern unless you are actually going on their ERP system, which could be another challenge. I don't know, which direction you want to go. But in general, the way people think or companies think is that, okay, if I have my corporate, I'm thinking that I'm probably going to be consuming all of the processes, whatever you're going to have from these smaller companies that I am trying to acquire. And some of the interesting use cases that personally I've seen is, okay, if you are let's say the manufacturing company, and now you are trying to acquire a distribution company, people are going to assume, hey, I can manufacture. How hard distribution could be.
Yeah.
And that's the mistake they make because they have no idea. Every single business model could be extremely, extremely challenging. It has different processes. It's going to have very different data model. And then you get into these interesting issues. So I don't know. Yeah. Go ahead.
And you're trying to find those synergies, right? And those synergies aren't there. So there's assumptions you really got to work on. And my last company was owned by a joint partnership. So one of our parents, their model was wherever I go in there, I rip everything out, I put my standard in, I spend the money, I make sure it works, and I go on because they didn't like surprises. And I can see that because some of them we did a little more saving and we had surprises. But I think when you do that, you throw out the infrastructure, you put your standard network in, you throw in your firewalls, you throw in this, the standard solution, the business, and you map it all over. I think it costs a little more, but it's going to save you a lot of pain later on. And you're just basically not inheriting a lot of those debts that you would. You're taking the bite early.
Yeah, so very interesting comment there, not liking surprises. And I always say this, if you don't like surprises, don't get into ERP game at all. Okay, never ever. Okay, just don't touch it because you are always going to find surprises. There is no way around this. And, the amount of surprises that you're going to find, even if you do everything right, is still you are going to find unknowns. Okay, and one of the problems that most businesses struggle with is, okay, and I don't know where you sort of stand on that positioning, Fred. Would love to hear your perspective. But when we are trying to advise as the IT people, I guess, that hey, you gotta do your due diligence. Okay, if you don't like surprises, okay, you have to invest a lot. And sometimes that could be a frustrating experience for a business guy. So let's say if I'm investing my own personal money, Fred, and I'm investing in this whole due diligence process, which is great, but these guys are going to think that, okay, what is a tangible deliverable here? Can you show me? Then you go through this, and we are trying to tell them that, hey, buddy, you have no idea how much trouble I'm saving for you. You have no idea how much you would have got, but you are not seeing it because you just don't realize it. So that's where I guess, our challenges are, Fred, from our experience that, okay, whenever you talk about due diligence, they're going to say, you know what, let's just spend 2 weeks.
Yes. No, I agree with you. And you have to think about that whole project model, right? We always talk about testing and where do you find testing? The earlier in the model you'll find it, the cheaper it is to solve, right?
Exactly.
But if you go to user acceptance testing and then you find this model problem, it's now way more expensive than what you would have spent for a consultant or someone else to help you for an extra couple of weeks or the right amount of due diligence. So you're basically going to Las Vegas, putting money down on and hoping black comes out, right? But red or green double zero might come out, and then you're going to spend the money. And now we always talk about how user acceptance, change management. Now you have a bad first impression that this thing is wrong, and they lose some credibility in that you said this worked and it didn't. It was a totally different model. So now, do you understand my business process? Can you train us? Is this solution really going to work? All that starts spiraling up, and you want to control what you can control. And if you can control the due diligence process and go a little deeper, that can solve that problem.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the benchmarks, I guess. I mean, this is the time and everybody is going to be interested in knowing, okay, how much should I invest, I guess? I mean, that is the golden question, and nobody has answers for those things, right?
No,
You are going
I
to have
agree.
just some of the industry standards, right? So, for example, let's say, and maybe you can create some sort of buckets, whatever you feel comfortable with.
Sure.
Obviously, you are going to have the enterprises; their problems are going to be more. You have a little bit of mid-market. I don't know. You can use revenue buckets or employee buckets or whatever you want to use.
Sure.
But let's say if you were to create some sort of benchmarks, how much time, energy anybody should be investing in the due diligence phase versus and define what should be the scope of due diligence phase versus the implementation. So give us some sort of numbers in terms of how companies should be planning for these things.
Oh, that's a tricky one. So what I would say is, I would I would do a two-phase part.
Yeah.
One, I would kind of evaluate what kind of company I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
So do a high level assessment of what do you see there, what do you don't see there, to find out how many holes you have, right, and how deep you have to go. I think if you're coming from another strong company, a company that prides itself on how it delivers that stuff, that due diligence may be a little smaller because they're gonna be very, very good at giving you, their governance model. They're gonna give you here's all the trainings around how the ERP system works, the designs, the process flows, everything, right? So when you start seeing those kind of things, and you understand how this model works together, you're like, okay, that makes sense. I'm going to go in. I'm going to, I'm going to trust but verify a lot of this stuff. But that may be a smaller model. And then and if you're looking for that technology perspective, I'm going for technology. You may even go as small as 30 days and get a very decent idea of what you're going to spend in this scenario, right? The smaller you get, it can go longer. And there's another nuance in there too, is how much are they going to tell you in this discovery period, right?
Yeah.
Because you may not have access to the ERP guy. You may not have access to their system. The guy who's answering your questions, the person who does the work works 2 levels below him, and he doesn't have all the right answers. So that all plays into it too. And you can say, well, I'm going to do my due diligence, and it's going to take me this amount of time. But guess what? Red flag or yellow flag, you're going to spend more later because we don't have the visibility. Are you okay with that risk, right? If you're throwing it all away, you may be more okay with it as opposed to I'm going to adopt it. So I know it's not the answer you're asking for, but that's the model I would use when I'm evaluating this, is to see how much information I can get, what can I base on that information, and then what is that showing to me later through this whole integration process. Well, it may be TSA costs. You may have just found out this thing may not cut in and say, hey, you may have to expect, you may get a 12-month TSA because this may be a hell of a lot more complicated than we have. And, we just did the last acquisition. We might have the right resources for this. So plan that into your model, because it may be an extra 6-7 months before you get the benefits you're looking for.
So what is a TSA? People might not be familiar with that. Do you want to describe that?
Yeah, it's a transitional service agreement. It's when you put two companies together. Well, no, when two companies are splitting apart, they're still working together. Because if you're stripping a company out of another company, there's a lot of services. Like you think about shared services and other things it does. Even their ERP system, they may need that for a period of time. And so the two companies come to an agreement and say how much those costs would be while you're using those services until you turn them off and replace them with your own.
Yeah, so very interesting. So, I mean, now we have spoken about the benchmark. So now let's go back to some of the mistakes. And I'm pretty sure, Fred, you have probably made some mistakes yourself. You have seen other executives making mistakes. And now, some people are going to be super excited. Okay, I'm getting director position, VP position, CIO position. Good luck. Okay, what are some of the rookie mistakes that you have seen in your career that some other folks can avoid, I guess?
And specifically around acquisitions or
acquisition, it could be ERP implementation when they go into these engagements. What are the mistakes that you have seen?
So, I mean, the basic one that we all know and we hear and we just don't do because we get enamored or we get pressure is plan correctly, right? So take the time to plan. Take the time to break it apart, to look, to ask the right questions, to get the right people in the room. The problems I made before is I assumed things. I mean, I was doing an ERP implementation for an aerospace company, and they told me to if you talk to these sites, they have all the models for everything else. And, these big plants cover all the small business processes. Well, first of all, that wasn't true.
Yeah.
Second of all, I just pissed off 5 people because I never talked to them. And so they're the kind of situations that due diligence you need. You need to establish those relationships with people. You need to ask the questions. You need to make sure you understand what's going on. And don't be afraid to ask the questions over and over again. Never assume anything. The assumptions are the worst thing. If you assume it's there, half the time it's not there, or it looks very, very different. And so I've had those situations with acquisitions that I assumed something was there, or I assumed something was coming over. We never asked the question. And they said, no, we're wiping every system on cutover day. You got to reinstall everything, and you're not getting any of that stuff. And I'm like, whoa, wait a second. That's a different plan. And we're doing that over a weekend. Where's I have to get resources, right? So there's things like that come on that you have to ask those questions. And I think they're the problems that really, stand up in the back of your head as you're going through this. Like, hey, I'm not going to make that mistake again. I mean, it almost goes back to my early ERP days when I made a mistake that shut the system down. Those are the kind of things that you remember that you're going to say, I'm never doing something like that again. And I'm going to tell the story to a lot of people, and I'm going to ask the right questions. And I think that's the thing. When you make those mistakes, or when you see that you make assumptions and you haven't planned right, if you don't plan right, plan for something to come up later, and plan, because it's going to happen. Something is going to surprise you. It's bound to happen. Murphy joins every project you do, and he is very active on it. So be prepared for that.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. And one of the reasons, I guess, and I don't know what has been your sort of reasons. I mean, it's never going to be just that we could not remember these things, right? I mean, sometimes these could be tricky as well, because there are always going to be political issues, okay? So my personal challenge whenever I do these engagements is that, it's always going to be like the political, in terms of, okay, that you are trying to describe, you are trying to articulate these things to a lot of people who might not have as much background. And obviously they would like to know every single answer possible. And sometimes you might not be able to explain. You probably have this in your gut that, look, I've seen this. I don't feel comfortable doing this. Let's not do that. I may not be able to explain, but let's not do it.
Exactly.
But your executives are going to challenge that maybe this guy is probably overthinking. And let's just go ahead, and then you go ahead with the group thing, because 4 people are saying that just do it, I guess.
or we've done this before, right? It starts like this one. I talked this owner down to a sweet deal. We got $20 million off. He really wants to retire. You know what? Whatever. I don't care what it is. We got this at a great deal. It's so much like this one. Don't worry about it. We'll just throw a little money in there for you guys to do the cutover, and it'll be fine. And you're like, wait a second here. That may be true, but that sweet deal you have, I need you to allocate some money and time, because it's going to come here, because they didn't answer these questions, and the answers I got were just telling me there's something there.
Yeah, and how do you, obviously the financial part is going to be super interesting as well, and the executives that have not done this before, I guess, for them it's always challenging. It's always challenging to foresee why these things take so much time, why they require so much planning, why it cannot be less expensive, I guess. And sometimes it's very hard to explain. So in your experience, let's say if somebody is doing this for the first time, let's say I'm the CFO, and I mean, I see your challenge, Fred, but I just feel that there must be an easy way.
Yeah.
So how would you convince me, I guess?
Well, first of all, if we didn't have people involved, it may be an easier way. But you do have people involved.
Exactly.
And people can only absorb a certain amount of change at a certain rate. And they have to learn where you're going. And they have emotions. And they're going through this process. And their best friend just got fired as part of this, or laid off. So that's the first part. The second part is I can give you very specific costs for very certain things. We're going to have to run M365. Here's my E3 or E5 licenses. I evaluate number of people. Boom. Here's your cost. It's going to be plus or minus 5%. You're great. Now, when you get down to the ERP and other situations, I'm going to give you an assessment of how complicated I think this is. It could be small, medium, large, extra crazy, right? And then based on that, I'm going to say this is going to give you some cost and time, and be prepared for it. Now, you can run them separate if you want to and not take those synergies on there, but eventually you're going to have to bite that bullet if you want to take those benefits, right? You can run it probably for, if you're saying, well, I just want to get them up and over and put them on half these things, sure, but you're not getting your benefits. And when you come to get your benefits, we're still going to go back to the same issue. It's this high, complicated, very different. They're missing stuff, and we're going to have to spend some time doing it. So make sure that cost stays there, and don't be surprised, because that's why I told you it was more complicated, right? So I think it's that education that you have to say, the less I know, the more we have to prepare for doing something different. And the more they are different from what we do today, the more to understand there's change management issues, and there may be process change issues. And if you're on a niche ERP system that's very specific for a certain industry, those processes are if you're switching them around, and you're trying to map these in there, it's going to be a big change management issue, because you really don't have the flexibility to do two different processes.
Yeah, so very interesting. So we are coming close to our time right now, Fred. I don't know if you're going to have any sort of closing advice, and obviously you want to share how people can find you if they might have any sort of follow-up questions.
Sure. So first of all, I would say thank you for having me on today. I love the conversation. You challenged me, made me think, and that's great. The industries are interesting, and I've been in multiple industries. I started in SAP, and I've done a lot of ERP implementations across all different types of manufacturing and even other industries. And I went to aerospace. Every industry has its unique things, and I know you know that. And the fun thing is, when you go through, is find out what's same and what's different. I would always suggest, when it's the same thing when companies are coming together, or pieces of companies are getting together, what's same, what's different, what do you know and what you don't know, and take the time to really break that apart, and get someone in there who can ask those questions, who maybe not be emotionally attached to it, who may not know the way you do it today and the way they do it today. And they can go back and give you a real objective assessment. I think those things are so important, especially when you're pulling companies together, because if not, you're going to have unexpected timelines, unexpected costs, and unexpected change management issues. And the more you plan up front, and you may not always have that time, but the more you can invest in that time, the more that transition is going to work well. Now, if anyone wants any help from me, or wants to talk to me, or just bounce ideas, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm F Donatucci, or Fred Donatucci. You find me on there, and I'm willing, just reach out. I'm willing to help out any way I can, and explain share some of my expertise and some of my learnings over the years. So, thank you very much. It was great. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, of course. And it was, my learning, I guess. I mean, see, I always learn a lot from these conversations. So thank you so much for sharing insights, Fred. On that note, if you joined for the first time, this was part of our podcast series. So make sure you guys stay tuned for the future episodes. We are going to bring a lot of these episodes, next week as well. Same time, Friday, generally between 8 to 11 a.m. And the best way to know about the episodes is going to be just follow my feed on the LinkedIn profile. On that note, thank you so much once again, Fred, for your insights. And thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in today.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the WBS Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform so you never miss an episode. For more information on growth strategies for SMBs using ERP and digital transformation, check out our community at WBS.rocks. We'll see you next time.